Welcome to another episode of Presentation Hell. I am your host today, AlexAnndra Ontra, and with us here, Burning in Hell, we have Elyse Dussia. Elyse is the owner, founder, president, and do all of EMD Clinicals. She does content creation for pharma, biotech, and medical communications. Essentially, she's done a shit ton of presentations for the medical industry, and as some of you may know, they are incredibly detailed, incredibly long. I don't want to say boring because, the subject matter is usually life or death, but they have a lot of detail and statistics and clinical trials and charts, and they are huge eyesores. That was a great setup. The work you do is an eyesore for anyone in the audience.
Thanks, Alex.
So, Elyse, thank you for being here. We're very happy to have you. Can you tell us your background? Because you're a medical doctor, so you kind of got into presentations. Tell us about that journey.
Absolutely. So, yes, I went to medical school, started my residency, and decided that clinical medicine was not really where my passion was, and I fell into... It was, at the time, the turn of the century, which gives my age away, an internet-based company. It was putting medical information on the internet for free for the layperson. And so I fell into medical writing that way. And over time, the field developed, and it became more of writing presentations, writing at a peer-to-peer level, which means that a physician would give a talk to other physicians and or nurses, other healthcare professionals, to learn about either a disease state or a new medication that was coming out, the efficacy, the safety, all of the things that were included in all things medical education.
So that's great. So basically, just because you liked writing and you were passionate about it, you just started doing it on a website, and then that led to basically a career in medical education, medical writing.
Pretty much. I think it was a combination of enjoying writing and also enjoying learning. My favorite thing about school was all of the learning, the constant education of myself, and then imparting that to other people was a passion of mine as well.
You like to study?
I do. I'm a nerd.
So let's talk about medical presentations for a minute, because they are hell. They are... like I said before, they're very long, they're very complicated, and there are a lot of requirements when you're doing a presentation in the medical industry that really aren't required for all industry. There's so many restrictions, so many regulations, so many compliance issues that everybody has to solve and follow. To get there is kind of a long process. So for our listeners, let's talk about what is it about, what is it about pharmaceutical medical presentations? What are those challenges? And because they do apply to others, other industries, and how do we overcome them? How do we address them? So this is more in the creation of presentation content and what needs to be done and the process involved in getting those presentations together.
Sure. So I would say, for one, there's more than one client or customer of the presentation. Ultimately, there's the company generally, so a pharmaceutical company or biotech company that has hired a medical communications team to write this presentation. So there's always a topic that needs to be discussed. There's always, business goals in terms of what they need to achieve, and also what is the goal for the customer, in this case the audience. What are they going to get out of this presentation? What makes it worthwhile? What makes it valuable?
So let's break that down for a minute. So I'm the brand director in a medical company, in a pharmaceutical company. I'm creating this presentation. I need to lay out my goals for my audience. And who are my audience? They doctors, they nurses, they clinicians, they are... Right. All of the above.
Well, it depends. So that's one of the things when we're initially having kind of a kickoff call for a particular presentation. My questions will be, what ultimately is the goal? What do you need the audience to either change behavior to get out of this, change belief system, change their thinking, to learn about? That would be the first. Also, the audience. What level do we need to be communicating at? Is this something for patients? Is this something for caregivers of patients? Is this something for expert physicians? Is it for nurses? There's different focuses and different language you would choose, different visuals, different kinds of infographics based on the customer and the audience that you're trying to reach.
So a presentation for a doctor versus a presentation for a nurse versus a presentation for a patient.
Exactly.
What are the differences?
Exactly. Well, for a physician, I would say that is the person who's going to be prescribing the medication. So there usually is a lot of interest in what's the mechanism of disease behind, why would I choose this therapy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends on what is the mechanism behind the disease itself, and then what is the mechanism of action of that medication, and does that scientifically, medically make sense that this particular medication would address a particular disease.
So in lay terms, what's causing the disease and how does this medicine affect the patient?
Right.
And the doctor has to figure all of that out. And it's
You
not
have to
always
lay it
the
out.
same for every single patient. So they have to discern and discriminate.
Right. So the
and
story.
weed through. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to
No, go ahead.
overtalk you. Right. So the story of the presentation, because presentations, as you mentioned, can be quite dry and quite boring. The goal, I think, of any presentation is to make it interesting. And in order to do that, you have to have a story. So what is the story? What are you trying to impart?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you can lay out carefully and in a medically accurate presentation, it needs to be done in a very logical fashion so that someone can say, oh, this makes sense to
Right.
me now that you've explained scientifically what is going on. I can infer and put together for myself and have a belief that this might work. Maybe I could try this in an appropriate patient.
Right. So that's an interesting thing that you just said, lay out the story. Because in the medical industry, it's a lot of statistics. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of results from clinical studies, a lot of charts, a lot of graphs, a ton of data that all needs a ton of disclosure statements to follow it. But you got to an important part about the doctor needs to tell the story, or the presentation needs to tell the story, because ultimately it's about people. It's about people, and it's about their health, and that is personal. That is the most personal. And one of the things where, especially in corporations, we tend to hide behind the data because it's like, oh, I put the chart up, and therefore, well, that explains it all because all the data is in the chart, but most people can't read charts. And so it's always important to take that data and translate it and ask the question, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for a regular person who's sick or who has needs or is scared or is tired or is hungry? Always bring that human element to those statistics. And again, it works for pharma. It's pretty much any presentation, any industry. It's always about the story. It's always about the person and what they're feeling. We think rationally, but we act from emotion. It's like the emotion drives the motion.
Yeah, and also you're trying to capture the audience members' interest as well, especially if there's let's say you've provided this presentation at a symposium. There's 15,000 people at an annual congress, and you have a couple of hundred individuals in your room, but they've been at this congress all day long. They're tired.
Yeah,
they're hungry. They'd like to go to bed or go,
and
be done with
sat
work.
through a lot of presentations already.
Right.
Right.
So you want to capture the interest of the people in the room and hold that interest so that they're listening to the person that's presenting to them.
Have you ever done anything out of the ordinary when giving those presentations to snap the audience back into attention? Somebody, like you just said, in a symposium that's been sitting in windowless rooms for hours, looking at slides for hours, listening to presentations for hours, listening to presentations from doctors and pharmacists who are great people, not necessarily the most exciting presenters because that's not their main job. What would you, have you ever done anything totally crazy, like brought in a purple gorilla or a total gimmick, or is there anything?
I wouldn't say that
Purple gorilla, bad idea?
No purple gorillas in my experience.
Doctors are very serious people.
They can be. I mean, one thing that can be done is mix it up. So it's not just a didactic presentation all the way through. newer technologies such as using like surveys in the middle of presentations. That gets everybody, pull out your phones and answer this question we're going to give you.
It gets them involved.
Gets people
engaged. It makes them
engaged.
accountable. Yeah.
It changes, it brings everyone to attention because now they're changing from the passive listening situation to now they're having an action and they're actually contributing, and then the answer is going to be up on the screens for everybody. Or you can change presenters sometimes and give just the pieces of the topics that is that person's specialty. So you're really excited you're going to hear from Dr. So-and-so about this topic, but wow, they've gotten this other major national speaker to speak on, the medication. And that way you can generate interest by not just the topic of the information, but by the big dog that's telling it to you.
So I'm going to shift gears for a minute and ask you, like, what was the best presentation you ever made or gave, and why?
One that comes to mind, actually, it was a presentation for Genentech. And
I remember. We used to work together on those Genentech presentations years ago.
And it was a very high science mechanism of disease for an autoimmune disorder, which was rheumatoid arthritis. And there had been a lot of research done into different types of immune cells and how they all interacted in the body to create the disease, and then to also create biologic therapeutics, which was the big
brand new at the time.
Paradigm type of medicine at the time. And I, along with a specialized graphics company, came up with a presentation where the cells themselves came to life. So every cell had a particular look, and they moved across the screen, and you got to see them interact in the joints. And we had two physicians that worked with me on the content, but then also gave the presentations at national congresses. And they loved the presentation because they had a part in it, in creating it, and they were proud of it. And then it ended up winning an award at Genentech for being,
cool.
a really good presentation. But I think what was great about it was it wasn't a bunch of charts. It was actual pictures and, moving animations. So it was more like a movie. You got to see what was happening inside the joint.
So, and it was like, and I don't remember seeing those, it was like the T cells and the phagocytes and the leukocytes, and they're all moving through the blood. And I know nothing about medicine. I was just helping put this presentation together and watching these videos and how they affect the organ and the bone and all of that stuff. It was super cool. The funny thing now is after COVID, everybody knows what T cells are. So
I'm just impressed you remember all of those
words.
Because
that's how good that animation was. I remember I was like,
you.
wow, this is really fascinating. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I thought it was really cool. What's the worst presentation? And you can go back to like college, medical school, Girl Scouts. I don't know.
There have been several. I would say, in addition, when you're writing for pharma, it's not just the pharmaceutical company that is your and the audience that you have to worry about. It's also the FDA, because every piece of medical communications that goes out needs to follow a very well laid out guidelines that you have to follow in order for each presentation to be unbiased, to be medically accurate, to not be skewed. And so there's a lot of rigor that goes into making sure that the presentations are not biased in any way. And, sometimes you have a client who's a marketer and wants to push the envelope and wants to, and that's partially, that's their job.
Exactly.
That's their job. And my job as, the director of the content is to make sure that we are following within guidelines. And so I would say there's been times when a presentation loses luster because, we're not going to say any of the, sort of the
exciting
more on
stuff.
the edge, on the edge stuff, or the pharmaceutical company who has a committee themselves that takes a look at the content before it ever goes to the FDA. They take out all of the cool stuff, and then you're left with kind of a very basic, I didn't say anything new. Why would anybody come to this talk for a whole hour? I didn't say anything that is new or interesting.
But you have the cool animation.
If
the phagocytes and the leukocytes and the T cells attacking the bone marrow.
Only if they paid for that. If they did not pay for art, if there's no art direction, then they're stuck with my doodle drawings on a slide, right?
Well, doodle drawings are nice. Sometimes simple really is the best way.
It's true.
So I want to like touch on that point where you just talked about getting the FDA approval and getting the regulatory approval at the pharmaceutical company itself, because one thing is doctors are allowed to say certain things, nurses can say certain things, contracted speakers, sometimes patient advocates, because they get hired if they have the disease and they took the medicine, they can go talk about the disease and their experience. They're allowed to say certain things, all to different audiences, and that becomes, on top of that, you have all of the data that you need to present, but then you also want to weave in the human element, the story. So it's like the perfect storm of challenge that medical industry, has to achieve. And what we found is if you break up the chapters, this is the nurse chapter, this is safety and efficacy for nurses, this is safety and efficacy for doctors, this is safety and efficacy for patient advocates, and then you put them in like a wizard type of thing, then it makes it easier for the speaker on the front end who's making that presentation just to pull the slides together.
Absolutely.
Because one thing is the company makes the presentation, but then somebody way out in the field, completely detached from that process, has to give the presentation. So you're equipping its creation, its segregation and distribution, and then its presentation. It's like a multiple stages.
Yeah, and I think inherently, because of the guidelines that we're under, there's a want and a need. There's a desire on behalf of the speaker to say, well, I want to give the presentation in my own way, in my own words, and I don't want to just be given a boilerplate and have to stick to the script.
Right.
And there are creative ways, which you and I came up with together using your tool,
the presentation builder,
for a particular client, in which we were able to provide customized presentations within a set of rules. So it met all the criteria that was required to meet all of the guidelines and to fall within compliance, but also have a creative solution for customizing presentations.
So the corporate pharmaceutical company, they got their compliance, and the speaker on the front end got their flexibility, and the audience, most important, got the information they needed to administer the drug properly and help people heal.
And that was a real win, because there was a lot of pushback from the speakers that hated the slide decks in the beginning. Because
why did they hate the slide decks?
They were so rigid. They were so rigid. They were boring. There was no ability to put any creative flair onto it and your own stamp, if you will, for the different speakers. But once we were able to cut up the content more into chapters or modules, and then within reason, they could be fitted together as they wished, and they could be customized for their different presentations and audiences that they had to present in front of. That made everybody happier, which is always a good thing.
Yep. All right. So just to summarize, some tips for presentations for the healthcare, med ed, pharmaceutical industries. The story, the human element is important. It backs up the data. Give speakers in the field some flexibility. You can cut your presentations up into chapters and let them pick and choose their chapters while staying compliant. And I think that's about it. Elyse Dussia, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.